If you believe the United Nations government, what happened on May 8, 2219 was a tragedy, lessened only by the immense bravery of the crews involved. If you believe most analysts, what happened was a confused mess that killed hundreds or thousands of humans, Tralaxians, and various other species, for no good reason. And if you believe most sailors in the United Nations Stellar Navy, what happened was one of the greatest victories in the history of the branch. It is not unusual for details of a battle to become obscured, of course. Even things as long passed into the historical record and obsessed about as Waterloo, Stalingrad, or Chicago will forever have a shroud of mystery surrounding at least some aspect. What was passing through a commander's mind? How many were involved in a specific action? Whether this or that move was more consequential to the overall outcome? But the Hull incident, as the events of that day have come to be known, are completely hidden from anywhere approaching a full understanding. What is certain, through public record, are a few key details. The United Nations Postal Service vessel, Cherami, was scheduled to enter the star system of Koto in order to deliver new communications equipment to a few scattered scientific outposts and automated stations. And, of course, deliver some mail. As this system sat directly beside the line, the vague border between the Geneva Pact and the League of Balof, the Cherami will be escorted by the Red Cliffs-class battleship, UNV Hull, and the twin Guterres-class destroyers, UNV I'm Getting Buried in the Morning and UNV Delta P, with said ships conducting routine patrols alongside their escort duty. In other words, a perfectly normal occurrence that had happened thousands of times without incident. On the other side, it is certain that a fleet action group of the League of Balof was present in the area at the time, officially conducting a freedom of navigation exercise as part of the League's ongoing campaign to demonstrate control over its claimed area. The campaign was of particular political importance, given the League was experiencing growing internal strife over a sense of stagnation and economic slowdown. The United Nations had not yet become embroiled in the Regal campaign, and fears were increasing inside the League that they no longer could reliably hold back a Geneva Pact offensive if a war were to break out. Thus, the exercise was meant to serve as a reminder to the Pact that the League remained committed to defending its territory, no matter what. To this end, the Fleet Action Group consisted of 2 Type 798C battleships, 6 Type 824A cruisers, and 3 824Bs, and 11 Type 376L destroyers. Hardly a premier task force. Even the newest vessels, in the form of the 376L, were a generation behind the bleeding edge of the League. But certainly a meaningful force, or else it would not be in the field. Other noteworthy information is that a month earlier, Sirius Initiative operatives discovered the world known to the United Nations as Renhai, inhabited by a thin sliver of pre-FTL humanoids desperately clinging onto life amidst the ruins of their civilization. The details of this discovery are best related elsewhere, but for the purposes of discussing the Hull incident, it is worth acknowledging a few basic facts. First contact with Renhai was accelerated due to the dire circumstances of its inhabitants, resulting in the diversion of the Carlson-class carrier UNV-1 Santa Maria from scheduled exercises to provide aid. This sudden redeployment was communicated to the League, given Renhai's proximity to the line, but given the urgency with which it occurred, the warning was not fully disseminated by the time the 1 Santa Maria was spotted in the area. Given a Carlson-class can single-handedly launch and win an invasion of the kind of worlds found around the line, it was no surprise that low and mid-level commanders in the League of Balof, who had not yet been informed of the 1 Santa Maria's purpose, interpreted its deployment as a possible prelude to a surprise offensive by the United Nations. As a result, League crews were on edge, the lower levels of FleetCom gripped with a paranoia their commanders did not share, or even quite understand. Exercises had been lengthened, toughened, turned into farces that pushed exhausted crews and vessels beyond any reasonable point. The upcoming Confederation Day celebrations also increased the strain, with the Fleet Action Group having been held back from deploying in order to receive a shipment of dress uniforms. This stress, it is believed, contributed to whatever was to come. It was also entirely missed by Geneva Pact intelligence, or if it did, no warning of a potentially volatile situation was communicated to local commanders. Finally, the aftermath. This is the most clear portion, and where all of the theorizing derives from. Within 36 hours of the UNV hull and its escorts entering the system of Koto 1, Type 798C, 3 Type 824A, 1 Type 824B, and 6 Type 376Ls were destroyed outright. The other 798C, 2 824As and a B, and 3 376Ls were abandoned due to critical damage, and the remainder limped back to base with various degrees of mauling applied. A few hundred crew members of some of these destroyed ships were later returned to the League by the United Nations, along with a larger quantity of bodies. Fleets across the United Nations were placed on heightened alert, and the battleship UNV Tergalix surged into Koto with a full wartime accompaniment. Leaving the system was the UNV hull, near mortally wounded and dry on weapons, and the Buried under tow. The Delta P had appeared in an adjacent system, alongside the UNPS Cherami, broadcasting heavily encrypted transmissions at full power. All UN ships were directed to the Loki anchorage, under heavy guard for repairs and debriefing, with the Buried soon being scrapped due to damage, while the hull was eventually repaired for service at the Titan shipyard service, which it continues to this day, past all other ships of the Red Cliffs class. Within a week, a new incident occurred in which a Republic of Itorax task force breached the line in force, pushing understrength League forces to withdraw from the strategic system of NORAD without firing a shot. Tensions rose dramatically. The systems around the line became a sudden hive of military activity before public negotiations quieted the matter, and the system ended up in Republic hands, subsequently transferred to United Nations authority. This incident quickly grabbed all attention that had previously been directed towards the hull and whatever had transpired there, and so the ship and its crew were allowed to slip back into obscurity. Third-party investigators entering the system once tensions had died down, and Koto was no longer crawling with warships, found only a fraction of the expected debris, most of the major chunks having been cleaned up. According to the League, what transpired on that day was that a mutinous Fleet Action Group commander led his forces in an attempt to attack the United Nations, only to blunder into a minefield, then subsequently be engaged and defeated by a loyalist force. Meanwhile, the United Nations maintains that the hull and its escorts blundered into a United Nations minefield whose IFFs had malfunctioned, resulting in significant damage and loss of life. Delta P and the Cherami, which were unharmed by the minefield, simply executed the sensible option of exiting the danger zone entirely in order to broadcast for emergency help. Much of its armaments were used in clearing the minefield, or disposed of to minimize the amount of mass for its wounded engines to haul. The crews, both alive and deceased, were bestowed with many medals for their bravery in saving their stricken ships, and generous payouts given to the families of the latter. Neither side has ever even slightly challenged the claims made by the other, leaving the official narrative of events to simply be an amalgamation of the two. Unsurprisingly, this has not satiated many conspiracy theorists, nor rational analysts. The Hull incident has become the stuff of myth and legend. 1,001 different retellings from 1,000 different sources. It is not hard to find someone in the United Nations Navy who professes to have the scoop on what went down from a colleague supposedly on the Tergalix task force, or to have a friend whose uncle's brother-in-law's daughter's girlfriend's dad had been part of the investigation, or something to that effect. Constructing a credible timeline has been rendered impossible, partially due to the lack of information, partially by the natural process of bullshit generation, and partially by active efforts by the United Nations Office of Special Investigations to seed the information space with bullshit. Even the term is impossible to research, with an internet search of Hull Incident or Hull Incident Ship, simply providing a curiously high number of resources about something to do with Russian ships and trawlers from a few hundred years ago. It is safe to say that the Hull incident is so broadly poisoned a topic as to make it impossible to ever divine the truth of what happened that day, short of a sudden release of archives by the United Nations military. With that said, there are two leading alternative theories for the events in Koto that are currently accepted by those analysts and academics willing to touch the topic. But in order to explain them, some background is necessary on the vessel and people at its centre. The UNV Hull had been named for the Battle of Hull, the first battle fought by the United Nations Command against the Haitian Stellar Imperium in 2021, and the first engagement of the liberation of Britain. Like all Redcliffe's class, and especially the Flight 2 variants of the class, it was an ugly bastard, an ice cream cone mounted to a drink can, to quote one United Nations admiral. To quote a different admiral, responsible for advocating its procurement, it was near 2,000 meters of get the fuck out my way. Filled to the brim with high-grade lasers, ultra-relativistic electron beams, and missiles of all different shapes and sizes, the hull was built as a long-range jeweler that could tear fleets apart, especially when provided with its full complement of drone support ships, and even more so as the centerpiece of a fleet. Despite its undeniable presence on the battlefield and such a prestigious name, the hull was the target of significant mockery throughout its career, much like its two predecessors of the same name, precisely for said name. The reason was obvious, as it lent itself rather easily to obvious jokes about ship's hull versus the ship Hull. Despite this, it had a relatively good career prior to the incident, though largely devoid of combat, and was well rated in assessments. It has been speculated that whatever events transpired on that day in 2219, the crew saw it as a chance to finally rid themselves of the mockery attached to their name, and prove themselves. Wherever this may have contributed to what occurred, it is safe to say the UNV Hull is no longer spoken of in such manner amongst other crews, and that crew members never find themselves short of their drink of choice wherever they go, particularly in an attempt to loosen lips, admittedly. Finally, the commanders involved. In charge of the UNV Hull was Captain Jeung, a mild-mannered woman by all pre-incident accounts. Post-incident, she was shuffled to Army liaison duties, in what some suspected to be a punishment brief for some factional drama within the Navy, but has since made a return as the admiral who has served the United Nations extremely well. Her nickname of Kill Something Yung has never been adequately explained in official sources, and no evidence can be found of pre-incident usage. Meanwhile, information on the lead commander has been extremely hard to come by, but what little bits have been gathered suggested he was somewhat of a hardliner, and likely part of the aforementioned war hysteria gripping the lower rungs of the League. Badly sourced reports indicate his career had hit somewhat of a dead end, and that his staff were hardly top-notch on the best of days, with high turnover and a terrible working environment even before the stress of the pre-incident days. Whatever transpired that day, it is certain that this man was poorly equipped to deal with it. Now we must address the two most prominent narratives. As we shall see, both have strengths and weaknesses that make them more or less easy to believe. The first is rather straightforward, and is generally the more popular one amongst analysts. It argues that the incident started with a major navigational error conducted by the League forces, due in part to the high stress affecting the crews, and in part due to poor quality staff. In particular, the deputy commander of the task force is reported to have been extremely underqualified, with an alleged leaked intelligence report produced for the United Nations Stellar Navy describing him as a Felson. According to this narrative, the error led the Fleet Action Group to exit hyperspace in the Koto system, rather than its intended destination. The error was quickly recognized, but the commander, whose flagship was one of the two Type 798Cs, made a strange call. Since the line is hardly a legally defined border, but rather a representation of active control, his task force was, as far as he was concerned, in fact perfectly within their rights to maneuver through the Koto system, so long as their weapons were unloaded and intentions clearly broadcasted. In this strange interpretation of escalation management, the United Nations would be forced to be on the back foot, and would either have to quietly acquiesce to the transit, or resort to firing warning shots and threaten to escalate first, either of which presented propaganda value. And of course, propaganda value meant career value. Indeed, so the narrative goes, the task force initially faced no serious problems maneuvering through the Koto system, given its limited number of inhabitants. However, the Hull's discovery of their presence complicated things, as the Hull refused to simply acquiesce to their demands for easy traversal. Soon, the two sides were on approach to one another, and a confrontation began. As the two sides argued about who was permitted to do what, and before Captain Jeung could draft and send an initial report to advise her commanders of the situation, the League task force drifted into the path of an immense free-drifting United Nations minefield. Lacking in the correct IFS to evade attack, their sensors and defences being tuned down to avoid actively provoking the United Nations fleet, the commander assessing that they had enough provocations already for his purpose, a mine triggered in the vicinity of a Type 824A and crippled it in a single blow. Unsurprisingly, this was enough to throw the confused League task force into a panic, and convince them they were under active attack. Reactors were surged to full wartime emergency power, shields and defensive weapons brought up, and barrages of missiles fired off to clear the minefield. And, of course, missiles were fired towards the UNV Hull and its accompanying ships. Captain Jeung, recognizing a crisis, ordered the Cherami to flee, dispatching one of her two destroyers to ensure its safety from any potential pursuers, and to broadcast a warning message to attract reinforcements. Jeung decided to take on the task force with one battleship and a single destroyer, in the hopes of buying time for the civilian escape, and to hold back what was potentially the first wave of a League incursion into United Nations territory. From here, the narrative often splits into competing versions of events, before reunifying into one singular outcome. These different versions are, ultimately, simply assigning blame for the damage in different ways. Some argue that the Hull and Berid focus on largely defensive efforts, with the damage dealt to the League forces being by and large the result of the minefield they had become trapped in the middle of. Others argue that the League largely cleared the minefield, suffering additional casualties from it, but that the incident was characterized by a long-range artillery and missile duel, the Hull largely keeping range and dealing damage, while the Berid played goalkeeper and tossed the occasional salvo out. And some argue for a hybrid of these explanations. Eventually these converge on a singular accepted truth, that by the time a withdrawal was ordered, the damage had been done to either side, but the United Nations had ultimately come out better on the balance sheet. League Fleetcom subsequently declared the task force mutinous, a court-martial sentencing the commander to death, in order to make clear to the United Nations that this was a rogue act. While a compelling narrative, and having some useful evidence to support it, this story has fallen short in some areas. For example, the minefield is a rather improbable cause of escalation. No mention of free-drifting minefields in the Koto system was made by the scientific crews previously assigned to the system, despite such a thing obviously posing a major navigational hazard. The coincidence of it bumping into the League task force at the most critical time possible is also astronomically unlikely. Furthermore, even assuming this to be the case, even the most hardline and stressed League naval commander should have had the presence of mind to recognize he was not under attack from the Hull, since at the range involved, any attack would obviously have been seen coming. Other problems are obvious. Hyperspace navigation, by its nature, should not allow for these kinds of errors, no matter how stressed the crew may be. The jump should be automatically computed, with no room for errors like this short of intentional orders, and the sheer scale of the damage inflicted does not conform with the different accounts. For the League to have been so mauled in the mine-heavy version, the minefield would have had to be ridiculously dense, while also ignoring the question of how both United Nations vessels became so heavily damaged. The alternative narrative of it being a duel with the Hull and Berid has a more debatable problem, that the Cherami was scrapped by the UNPS within months, due to it reportedly being too expensive to maintain. While the vessel was certainly on the older side, as a Yakatekudli class, vessels of the same class would be in service for decades to come. It is impossible to say what exactly happened, but it is extremely likely the Cherami took some degree of damage that rendered the ship not worth the cost of repair instead of replacement. If this was the case, it firmly debunks the idea of a long-range duel, since the Cherami should not have taken any fire before it escaped. Putting this aside, the Cherami would not in reality have required a destroyer escort if this was simply a misunderstanding, since no pursuit was likely, and Captain Jeung should have retained the Delta P for her own defense. Finally, both variants fail to explain the sheer degree of carnage inflicted. 18 ships on the League side were destroyed or abandoned, and the United Nations saw hundreds of its crews killed. A modern cutting-edge destroyer left a wreck, and a battleship extremely heavily mauled. For some sort of long-range duel from an incident to have done this beggars belief. Thus, a different narrative is increasingly taking precedence in explanations of what happened that day. In this version, rather than a comedy of errors that resulted in an exchange of fire and a withdrawal, the Hull incident was something far more sinister. Proponents note the well-accepted fact that the presence of the Juan Santa Maria put local League commanders on edge, and that a local clique of hardliners believed that it was a genuine prelude to war. They continue this line of thinking, arguing that rather than causing vague stress that resulted in errors, the hardliners decided to take action, intentionally provoking a confrontation in order to preempt an attack and demonstrate League superiority. Furthermore, this victory, it was presumed, would provide them and their allies more influence in the League's decision-making. Hence, the story goes, a plan was hatched. The likely hyperspace exit point had already been identified, and so the League task force was positioned nearby. This close range giving minimal time for the UN vessels to react. If any survived the initial barrage, which was not expected, they would have to flee with their engines facing the League, thus leaving many weapons unavailable. If they fled through hyperdrives, the League could simply ride the hyperspace wake and knock them back into reality. The hypercoms relay was also destroyed, eliminating the chance of the token presence in the system, providing early warning, and stopping the Hull from calling for reinforcements in combat. The United Nations and the galaxy at large would find out what had happened at Koto only when it was firmly in League hands. Thus, Captain Jeung found her ship suddenly under all-out attack from behind, despite having no prior warning and lacking the wartime complement of support vessels. Of course, all would have been in a ready condition as was protocol when exiting hyperspace, but there would be a serious psychological impact on the crews to find missiles screaming in towards them as they exited hyperspace, lasers starting to pound against their shields. The Hull, the Berit, the Delta P, and the Cherami found themselves ambushed by a numerically superior enemy, well prepared and spoiling for a fight. It should, by all reasonable predictions, have been a massacre, impossible to survive. And yet, in those brief moments, Captain Jeung did the impossible. The Hull flipped on axis, staring down its attackers, and let loose with every weapon system. The void around it became a boiling mass of missiles and lasers and particle beams, the full fury of a United Nations vessel at war. Its dusty plasma radiators glowed red-hot with the anger of 1,000 suns, perhaps one of many signs to the League crews that they had made a dramatic error. What ships fell first could never be known, but the ferocity with which it lashed out would have quickly added up. Jammers were flung to maximum power, aiming to turn the enemy's numerical superiority into a weakness, cutting off their ability to coordinate. Amidst this hell poured forth into the vacuum of space, the Cherami, already heavily damaged from the brutal pounding it had taken in the first few moments of the engagement, and Delta P, were ordered away into hyperspace, successfully making it away in spite of their damage. The Hull and the Berit therefore stood together, firing every weapon in their arsenal. Lasers were unleashed, incoming missiles blinking out of existence in milliseconds, as the rays pivoted from target to target faster than any living being could process. The Hull's own missiles poured forth, racing towards targets unprepared for the sheer ferocity of the counterstroke. Ultra-relativistic electron beams smacked at targets with immense amounts of energy, boiling away unprotected chunks of armor and evaporating crews with radiation. The Berit, crew perhaps seeing the irony in letting to live up to their name, provided what they could to the fray, and began to charge their own drive. Not for an escape, no, simply for a better position. The Hull, however, was not content to simply find a better position. Instead, The battleship, still spitting fire even as it ailed under the weight of blow after blow, tore a hole in reality first, the Bearer's captain receiving only 2 words as a message to forewarn of Jung's plan: "Guide us." While in hyperspace, Captain Jeung gave no grand speech to her crew, made no attempt to justify her intent to keep engaging rather than fleeing. There was no need to, for the crew were already fully set on fighting. Instead, Captain Jeung used the brief interlude, accelerating the ship once more to gain velocity for when it re-emerged from hyperspace in order to explain her plan. Here, she gained the nickname that has followed her ever since, stating her desire above all to get back into the fight, and do the one thing those Trelaxian bastards never could: kill something. The hull spent only 2 minutes in hyperspace, hardly time even for a deep breath. Instead, engines were thrown far past their wartime legal maximum, a burn so potent it would have caused crew members to black out were it not for acceleration couches and gravity generators. Even with them, it would have been a grueling moment, particularly as limited damage control was attempted. Captain Jeung sat in control, guiding the hull along an ever-adjusting course to precisely where she wanted it to be. Then it burst back into reality, its drive plume directly in the path of one of the 2 Type 798Cs, nose pointed straight at the 798C, acting as the command ship, just 1,000 kilometers away. The enemy had, of course, assumed the hull to be fleeing, and were thus charging their drives in anticipation of being able to intercept its hyperspace wake as it passed through their formation. Of course, they were also preoccupied with the missile salvo the hull had released before departing, further clouding their ability to predict what came next. They had not been able to understand why the Barrett had remained alone in system, desperately fleeing from them with its conventional drives, and as to why it was broadcasting the exact location of League forces so loudly over radio. Now, as the hull reappeared in their midst, as the largest guided missile in human history, every weapon system from Sea-Whiz laser to missile, to laser artillery, to UREB spitting in every direction, its engines alone melting through a battleship and leaving it crippled, they understood. What exactly happened next is debated by proponents of this narrative. In the conservative view, the League commander saw a battleship bearing down upon him at an ever-growing speed, and with less than a minute before it hit him, decided to get out of dodge. The ship triggered a random jump using the already spooled up drive with a random vector and coordinates. Unfortunately for him, a combination of the immense damage sustained and the stress of the random jump caused the failure of the hyperdrive, causing a calamitous scattering of a large number of his battleship's constituent atoms across the battlefield. The surviving chunks of the vessel variably flung aimlessly into hyperspace, or left adrift dead in the void. In the more radical view, the hull continued to accelerate towards the panicking 179C, only flipping at the very last moment and unleashing its drive plume as a weapon for the second time that minute. The consequences would be rather obvious. Whatever the truth, the charge of the hull broke the cohesion of the enemy fleet and ripped away their commander's ability to regain control. Their commander was dead, and his vessel lost. The other battleship was a crippled mess whose crew had effectively given up the fight in favour of desperate damage control, and the fleet at large was in a state of chaos. The surviving ship commanders were now leaderless, against an enemy that had decisively gained the initiative. To fix this problem would require a significant ability to improve, large amounts of tactical acumen, and coordination. None of these were on display that day in the League forces. Even if they were, the hull was putting enough energy into its jammers to blind God, and its weapons would have only added to the carnage wreaked upon sensors and communications. The greatest advantage the League now had, their numbers, was now turned into a weakness, each ship commander desperately attempting to coordinate once more, and failing. League salvos were fired out of sync, missiles rendered useless by uncoordinated targeting, and jamming by their own countermeasures, even before they faced the maelstrom generated by the hull's defences. Lasers lacked coordination, their aim points spread out across the hull rather than focusing on boring through specific segments of armour. Some debris fragments recovered even suggested fratricide by League weapons, though the legitimacy of this debris cannot be fully assessed. For all this trouble, the League forces were not toothless. It was around this point that the Buried was left dead in the void, its engines crippled by a nuclear glancing blow from a League salvo, that also fatally irradiated up to half its crew. The whole stunt, while eliminating its largest opponents and regaining the initiative, had put it directly in the range bracket it was least designed for, surrounded by enemies that still knew how to use their weapons, even if not in the most coordinated way. Every blow it took knocked out weapons, killed damage control crews, battered away at the armor. Any chance of escaping to further range had, if you believe the conservative version of events, been quelled by seeing a live demonstration of what happens to a ship with such damage jumping into hyperspace. It was not so much stand or die as stand and die, but the hull and its crew had made their peace with that. Every last missile was expended, large nuclear payloads rubbing shoulders with vast swarms of cheap soda can of death KKVs. Particle beams continued to fire until they were melted into oblivion, and even then they still attempted to get a few more shots out. Lasers scorched targets and their own coolant systems alike, all sense of safety gone in favor of a few more seconds of fire. It was undeniably, visibly, desperation, as overclocked reactors climbed higher and higher towards catastrophic failure. To all those present, it should have been clear that the hull was ultimately doomed. But at least one League crew thought differently. Amidst this nightmare, a Type 376L activated its already spooled drive, following a course straight out of the battlefield. His choice to do so would have generated one final brutal morale shock to the remaining crews, who had just seen so many of their comrades annihilated. The objective reality that the hull was increasingly crippled, and that simply a few more salvos could well have achieved its destruction, would be impossible to see in that moment. All they could see was a ship that refused to die, continuing to pummel targets into oblivion. It was no wonder what would come next. Dryers were activated, a mad dash away without coordination in mind, only a desire for escape. Jumps were made, ships disappearing as fast as they could, although at least one 376L was unable to enter its portal before a lucky pulse laser shot from the hull eliminated its drive, stranding it in Koto. Not all vessels could get away, though, with the crippled 798C being one of them. Those remaining began broadcasting messages of surrender, and the battlefield fell silent. When, a day later, the UNV Turgelix arrived with a full wartime battle group surrounding it, the crew found their sister ship huddled in close proximity to the buried, rendering what assistance it could spare, though its guns remained trained upon the surrendered League vessels, ready to jump back into the fray as soon as it became necessary. Thankfully, it did not. What followed was a series of hurried and wide-ranging backroom dealings between the League and the Geneva Pact. In these, the necessity of a cover-up was negotiated, the League highly embarrassed both by the defeat, but also by the complete lack of control over their commanders, demonstrated by such an incident. In return for agreeing to cover up such an embarrassment, the United Nations received both guarantees of a far more conservative stance from the League, and some other light rewards. The subsequent confrontation at Narrate was in effect merely a highly theatrical gift transfer, one meant to also draw attention away from Koto as the Geneva Pact tore apart the surrendered vessels, and attempted what cleanup they could. For those involved, the path was simple: debrief, medals, transfers to quieter work. Captain Jeung was shuffled away to the quieter task of liaison work as a reward, as soon as she had recovered from wounds occurred whilst participating in post-battle damage control. What occurred for the League crews who made it home is unknown, but it is suspected that many of the senior officers received painful reminders of their obligations regarding illegal orders. The above is, of course, simply another narrative, no matter how flashy it may be. There is very little evidence for it, and certainly many of the claims it makes are rather fantastical. It is no wonder that most who chose to examine the Hull incident settle for the simplicity of the first narrative, in spite of its flaws, because who could possibly believe something so absurd as the second narrative? As I stated earlier, it is impossible to know what narrative is ultimately true. Supposed photos can be, and often are, faked. Alleged crew testimonies can be, and often are, lies. Documents can be, and often are, fabricated. All truth dies in the face of the modern internet, and the efforts of the Office of Special Investigations to keep things under control. Perhaps even these competing narratives are themselves official fictions, meant to distract from a real one no one has yet thought to propose. There is certainly much suspicion from proponents of the second narrative towards the first, believing it to be a psychological operation to distract from the truth of the second narrative. Believers of the first often believe the second to be a psyop, to discredit their more reasonable explanation. Perhaps both are true at once. There are certainly even more alternative narratives, including fanciful ones, about supposed never-before-seen stealth ships duking it out, or some far larger engagement entirely covered up, or that the United Nations invaded NORAD that day, and failed. And perhaps, even if these are not deliberate fabrications by a government seeking to keep things under wraps, they are emotional fabrications. Stories told because they are more interesting than some boring, plausible reality. Certainly, there is more allure to the idea of a United Nations battleship near ramming a League counterpart, as the void of space turns into a hell so potent, Satan himself averts his gaze, than of a tragic tale of ships blundering into minefields amidst navigational error. It is not lost on those who study the Hull incident as a sociological phenomenon that the second narrative has found far more purchase amongst the Stellar Navy, a branch that is obviously receptive to a tale of brilliant heroics by its own. But there is one piece of evidence for the second narrative that is impossible to set aside. During a recent home visit, in which the hull was parked in geostationary orbit above its namesake town, the vessel was open to civilian visitors. This is common practice for United Nations vessels, and the crews have gotten well versed in batting away questions they are not permitted to answer. Even for a ship whose past is as mysterious as the hull, these questions are usually posed by unwitting civilians who think they will be able to just ask for the exact specifications of a state-of-the-art missile. Certainly, no one who served that day would ever be permitted to such a public-facing role, though the realities of it being several decades ago automatically preclude that, and the repair and subsequent refits have well concealed any signs of possible damage. And yet, a clue remains. In the main canteen of the UNV hull, mounted securely upon a wall, sits a strange piece of armor plate, large enough for 3 people to stand shoulder to shoulder in front of it. To those familiar with their contact war history, or those who have read the plaque, its nature is obvious. Armor salvaged from a Hectation IFV, alleged to be the first vehicle destroyed by UN forces during the liberation. Its surface is a mix of impacts from calibers now ancient to us, shrapnel from weapons long since retired, and some crude, faded graffiti left by joyous resistance fighters. The object has a near religious significance to the crew of the hull, as an artifact from such a momentous event obviously would, and so it has been left untouched since installation. Except once. On a corner, at the smallest scale any artist could possibly draw by hand, sits 18 marks, noticeably less faded than their authentic contact war predecessors. Simple X's, no attempt at detail. No explanation is provided as to their meaning, and crew members asked about it offer shrugs, claiming the marks have been there since before they were assigned.